All right, everybody. Well, thank you for being here with us today. We really appreciate it. We have a really interesting topic to go over today, and we'll let us turn it over to the Camoin people here. There's all kinds of them here
Yeah.
ready to go. So we'll pass it over to Rachel to do the introductions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Clay. Thank you so much for having us. Thank you, Matt. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, SEDC, certainly for hosting the webinar here. We're here today to talk with you about how economic development organizations can use economic and fiscal impact studies to inform decision making, improve your ability to measure outcomes, and also educate the public. I am Rachel Selsky. I am CEO at Camoin Associates. While Camoin Associates is a full-service economic development consulting firm, every year we do dozens of economic and fiscal impact studies for both the public sector and the private sector on all types of projects, everything ranging from small community theaters to large-scale, multi-billion-dollar mixed-use projects. I'm here today with our impact team. We have Connor Allen, Tori McNiff, Dawn Otterby, and Angela Hallowell. And we will be walking you through this webinar. Economic and fiscal impact can be a really technical topic and can be a little daunting to people who are not as familiar with some of the language or the methodologies behind it. So we're really aiming to provide a good background in terms of terminology, case studies, so you can see where it's been used in real life, and then examples of how impact analyses can be used to guide your decision making within your organization as an economic development professional. Our goal will be that you can walk away from this conversation with some ideas about how maybe you might be able to use impact analysis to inform your decision making about any tricky subjects you might be facing in your community. So economic and fiscal impact is one type of data-driven decision-making tool. Data-driven decision-making is really important for economic development organizations to communicate their strategies and outcomes to various stakeholders effectively. Economic development organizations can provide concrete evidence of their impact and the rationale behind decisions by presenting data that examines why a particular decision was made and provide insights to policymakers, investors, and the public. This approach not only improves credibility, but also facilitates more informed discussions about economic development initiatives. It provides people with the back end of the conversations and the various considerations that were made before the decision was actually finalized. Furthermore, the use of data visualizations can communicate complex economic development concepts more easily to make it more accessible and understandable to a broader audience, really bringing more people into the conversation. This enhanced clarity can lead to better engagement with stakeholders, increased support for your initiatives, and more productive collaboration between economic development partners and different organizations. So it's a really winning strategy to pursue greater engagement, understanding of the work that you're doing, and demonstration of your values. Transparency and accountability are fundamental to maintaining public trust and ensuring the efficient use of resources in economic development. Data-driven decision-making plays a pivotal role in achieving these goals by providing a clear objective basis for your decisions and your actions. By tracking the progress and effectiveness of programs over time, economic development organizations can demonstrate their commitment to achieving the stated goals and willingness to adapt based on measurable outcomes. So you can use economic and fiscal impact studies to measure how a particular initiative that you had identified as important, is that working, or is there a need to refine and adjust down the road? So you're able to really measure the outcomes. Comparing those outcomes to benchmarks and goals further reinforces the accountability, showing stakeholders that you are doing the work to measure the decisions you're making and measure your performance objectively. Any kind of analysis like that builds transparency and builds the trust of the public with your organization. Specifically, really looking into economic and fiscal impact studies, Analyzing the impact of a particular project or a program in terms of the jobs, earnings, tax revenue, public expenditures being put out are essential for EDOs to make sound financial decisions and demonstrate that you're really taking into consideration responsible use of public resources. You can leverage this data to identify trends, forecast future financial scenarios, and make really informed decisions about resource allocation. Using a more analytical approach allows for efficient use of limited resources, ensuring investments in economic development initiatives are aligned with fiscal realities. Through this webinar, you'll learn more about what economic and fiscal impacts are, what type of analyses can be used, best practices, case studies, and how they can be applied in the real world. During my work over the last 15 years or so, I have worked on economic and fiscal impact studies looking at a wide range of things, specific projects, tax credit programs, full industries, and economic development initiatives. And while I know I just spent the last 5 minutes really talking about the value of data and why numbers are important, I have actually found that economic development organizations that combine the data and the numbers with highly visual reports that pull in stories from real people affected by the project or the program in question are the most effective at making their case and demonstrating the value. And so I hope we can, while we'll definitely make the case for why, a hard methodology and a scientific approach is important, pulling in the stories and the real life examples of impact, combining them together can have the greatest impact in terms of value to the user and to your organization. So with that, I will turn it over to Connor to tell us a little bit more about terminology and some of the language and the methodology of economic and fiscal impact studies.
Thanks, Rachel. As Rachel touched on, I'll be outlining the components and key methodologies of economic and fiscal impact studies, providing a clear understanding of what these studies entail, their purposes, and how they're connected, giving us all better insight into their value and application. Let's start by breaking down what we mean by economic and fiscal impact studies. Economic impact studies aim to assess the broader effects that a project, policy, or business venture will have on a specific area, whether that's at the local, regional, or even national level. These studies don't just look at immediate financial impacts, but also how these changes ripple through the economy. For example, when a new factory opens, an economic impact study doesn't just measure the number of jobs created at the factory. It also examines how these jobs affect local businesses, supply chains, and household incomes. In essence, economic impact studies provide a comprehensive view of how a project can shape the economy by influencing job creation, business sales, and income levels. In contrast, fiscal impact studies narrow in on how a project affects government budgets. They answer key questions like, how will this project impact public revenue streams? And what costs will it impose on government services? These studies focus on tax revenue generated through property, sales, and income taxes. But just as importantly, they also consider the costs incurred by local governments to provide essential services like education, public safety, infrastructure, and utilities to accommodate the project. So if that same factory leads to an influx of workers moving into the area, there may be a need for new roads, schools, or even additional police services. Fiscal impact studies balance these new costs against the incoming tax revenue to help determine whether a project will ultimately be beneficial or costly to the local government. The purpose of both economic and fiscal impact studies is simple. They provide hard evidence that decision makers, whether in government, business, or community planning, can use to weigh the benefits and costs of a project or policy. In short, these studies inform us about whether the investment is likely to pay off for everyone involved. Next, let's dig deeper into the key components of economic impact studies. These studies are typically divided into three major types: direct, indirect, and induced impacts, along with the consideration of economic multipliers. Direct impacts are perhaps the easiest to understand. They represent the immediate results of the project itself. For example, let's say a new manufacturing facility is being built in a community. The direct impact would include the jobs created by the construction process, the wages paid to the workers, and the operating jobs once the facility is up and running. This is the starting point of an economic impact study, but it's only one piece of the puzzle. Indirect impacts occur when businesses affected by the project start purchasing goods and services from other businesses. Using our factory example, the facility may need raw materials, machinery, or equipment from local suppliers. Those suppliers in turn experience increased demand, and this creates a secondary level of economic growth. These upstream impacts are just as critical as the direct ones, as they support an interconnected web of businesses in the region. Induced impacts add a final layer. These occur when workers, whether at the factory itself or at the suppliers, spend their wages in the local economy. For instance, factory workers will spend their income on housing, groceries, dining out, and other everyday expenses. This spending fuels even more economic activity by boosting local businesses from real estate to retail and generate waves of economic benefits for the community. One way to visualize these layers is by thinking of a pebble thrown into a pond. The pebble hitting the water is the direct impact, while the ripples that spread outward are the indirect and induced impacts, expanding the economic activity across the broader area. Now let's talk briefly about multipliers. Economic multipliers are an essential concept in these studies, capturing the ripple effects that occur at that initial investment circulates through the economy. The multiplier tells us how much additional economic activity is generated for every dollar spent. For example, a multiplier of 1.5 means that for every $100 of direct spending, an additional $50 of indirect or induced economic activity is generated. This helps us quantify the full economic effect of a project beyond just that immediate spending. When conducting economic impact studies, several methodologies are commonly used. Input-output models, or IO models, are one of the most widely used tools. These models, such as InPlan, Lightcast, or REMI, map how different sectors of the economy interact with each other. For example, if a new factory buys raw materials from a local supplier, the IO model helps estimate the total economic impact of that purchase, accounting for all the various sectors affected. Lightcast in particular is frequently used to quantify the ripple effects, direct, indirect, and induced, that flow through the economy from the initial investments. Economic-based analysis is another approach, which focuses on identifying basic industries, which are those that export goods or services outside the region, and non-basic industries, which serve local demand. The idea here is that basic industries drive growth by bringing external revenue into the local economy, which then circulates, supporting jobs and businesses. Understanding which industries in your region act as economic drivers can help prioritize investments that bring the most value to your region. Finally, cost-benefit analysis, or CBAs, are a more straightforward methodology, ultimately comparing the total expected benefits of a project to its total costs. CBAs help decision makers determine whether a project's long-term gains justify its upfront costs. For example, building a new highway may be expensive, but if it leads to an increased business activity and property development along that corridor, the long-term benefits can easily outweigh the initial investments. Shifting gears now to fiscal impact studies, which focus on the effects of government finances and their key components. First, revenue gains. Revenue gains from a project come primarily through taxes. Imagine a new shopping center being built. This would directly increase sales tax collections, and property taxes would rise as the value local governments rely on to fund public services. But it's not just the taxes from the project itself. The increased employment and business activity will also contribute to local income taxes. But fiscal impact studies must also consider the cost to governments. These are the expenses incurred as a direct result of the project. For example, if a new housing development leads to an influx of residents, the local government may need to build additional schools, improve roads, or expand utility services to meet this new demand. These costs can sometimes be quite significant, and it's important to weigh them against the projected revenue gains. If the cost of a new public infrastructure or service outweighs the revenue generated, the project could have a negative fiscal impact. To get a complete picture, we look at the net fiscal impact, which compares new revenues with the additional cost of public services. In other words, it tells us if a project will be fiscally beneficial or a burden. Depending on the project's nature and size, this could either be a positive figure, where the project essentially pays for itself, or a negative one, where it would require more public funding than it generates. Another final factor is the role of incentives and subsidies. Often governments offer financial incentives like tax abatements or subsidies to attract projects. While these incentives can help bring in major developments, they can also reduce the immediate fiscal benefits. Fiscal impact studies help balance the short-term costs of these incentives against the long-term revenues the project is expected to generate. Fiscal impact studies also use several methodologies to measure the financial impact on governments. The first, the per capita method, distributes costs and revenues based on the population changes due to the project. This method is commonly used for residential developments where public services costs like schooling, utilities, and public safety scale directly with population growth. The case study approach compares the fiscal impacts of similar projects in other regions. By looking at the historical results of comparable projects, governments can forecast potential outcomes for a new project. This method offers practical insights based on real-world examples. The average cost method calculates the average cost of providing public services to new developments based on current service levels. For example, if adding a new development doesn't overwhelm existing services, the cost of providing those services may remain stable. And this method also assumes economy of scale will apply. The marginal cost method, finally, however, focuses on the incremental costs associated with providing additional services, specifically because of the new project. If the project requires expanding current infrastructure, like building a new school or upgrading roads, the method captures the true cost of these expansions. It's often more accurate for projects that push public services beyond their current capacity. So I hope that gave you all a little better understanding of what economic and fiscal impacts are and how these studies are conducted. I'll turn it over to my colleague Angela now to discuss better practices for conducting and interpreting impact studies.
Thanks, Connor. I'm going to take us through some best practices for conducting these analyses. So, like we said before, whether you're evaluating new real estate development, a public infrastructure project, or something in the realm of community services, really any of these sectors, the approach you take in your analysis can make a huge difference in the accuracy, relevance, and overall impact of your findings. So let's dive in, starting with the first key best practice, which is to take the time to determine the right approach. Every project you work on is unique and it's going to have its own set of nuances. So because of that, there really isn't one size fits all approach to conducting an economic impact analysis. The first step is always to invest the time up front to identify what is going to be the most appropriate methodology for the specific project we're working on. So this involves looking at factors like the scope of the project, the data you already have available, and what your ultimate objectives are going to be. So for example, it's important to ask yourself, who's my audience? Am I trying to secure funding? Am I trying to become eligible for tax abatement or simply to garner public support? Maybe your goal is to demonstrate the value that your organization brings to the local community. So the answer to any of these questions is going to guide the approach to the analysis. It's also critical to define the study area early on in the process. So a study area is used to be the geography that the impacts are analyzed on. So whether this is a city, a county, a state, maybe you have a custom defined service area that you operate in. This area specific to your project, getting this right will ensure that the results are relevant to the audience that matters for you. So moving on to the second key best practice, which is that consistency is key. So it's important to ensure that methodology used in an impact analysis is consistent. So whether you're looking to compare the results of one project to another or update a previous report that was conducted in the past, consistency becomes very important. So you'll want to maintain a consistent methodology and a consistent set of assumptions so that you're making an apples to apples comparison. This enables you to benchmark results and track trends over time. That said, consistency does not have to mean rigidity. Things change. You can evolve your methodologies as long as we're making sure that any changes are carefully considered and well documented. So this way, if a project changes down the line, a consistent approach will make it easier for you and also communicate your results to your audience a little better. The third best practice is to initiate a study at the right time. So timing is everything when we're conducting an impact analysis. First of all, we need to make sure that any key data is available before kicking off the project. So this could be something like construction costs, how many housing units are planned for a new mixed-use development, for example, or details of on-site operation after a project is finished and starting up. The process could force you to make more assumptions that may not hold true as the project progresses, and that can sometimes compromise the accuracy of your findings. So when is the right time to initiate an analysis? Often it's when a decision is looming, like whether you're reconsidering zoning laws, maybe you're deciding whether to offer financial assistance to a project, Maybe there's a grant deadline approaching and you want to include impact data in your grant that you're writing. So a typical impact analysis can take anywhere from 3 weeks to 6 months, depending on the complexity of your project and the availability of data. So it's important to think through the project timeline carefully as you're approaching. For a full fiscal impact analysis studies, like Connor was mentioning before, you'll also need time to gather input from key public officials. So whether you need to call local law enforcement, town management, the school district, to get better data about costs to serve and things like that. These interviews and gaining these insights can take time. So it's important to be sure to account for that in the schedule if you are approaching a full fiscal impact study. The fourth best practice I'll go over today is to research and vet assumptions. Impact analysis can be both an art and a science. In many cases, it will require analysts to make some key assumptions about the project's inputs. So taking the time to, put a lot of research into these assumptions and to vet them to ensure they'll lead to accurate results is critical. So something we do at Camoin Associates is that we always research our assumptions before we present anything to a client. This is critical for ensuring that the analysis will always relate to actionable, credible results. So we'll prepare a formal memo summarizing these assumptions, and then we'll share it with our clients to review and approve before we move forward with anything. And this just makes sure that everyone's on the same page in terms of the assumptions. Why does this matter? Right? Because assumptions can make or break your analysis. A solid foundation of data-driven assumptions is essential, and clearly communicating these in your final report is just as important. This ensures that anyone reading the report will understand what the study is or is not based on. The fifth best practice here is to involve the team throughout the process. It's important to include any key teammates as you're conducting this impact analysis. Collaboration with your team, stakeholders from the beginning of the process is essential. This will mean that everyone's on the same page when it comes to methodology selections, data sources, and any assumptions. By fostering clear agreement early on, you'll avoid any misunderstandings, and it will create a smoother process for everyone involved. When the entire team is involved, it really helps to ensure that all of the inputs are well understood, how the inputs are generated, what the outputs and results truly mean. And this collaborative approach leads to better results and clearer insights for your team and for your clients. And last but not least, it is extremely important to effectively communicate your results. At the end of the day, even the best analysis will not have the desired impact if it's not communicated effectively. So it's important to tailor your communication to your audience and what the objectives of your study are. So use clear and concise language, and also take advantage of visual aids like infographics or charts to make sure your points are easier to grasp. Highlight key findings, and most importantly, what the implications of those key findings might be. It's important to be prepared to explain any methodology and assumptions in case anyone has questions about it. And remember that not everyone will respond to data in the same way. Some people are really moved by numbers and data, but a lot of people are also more influenced by real life stories. So you might include a few case studies or call out boxes highlighting success stories of individuals who maybe benefited from your organization's programming. Or maybe you could highlight a business that will benefit from your new project. Combining, the hard data and numbers with these stories can really help paint a clearer picture of the true impact that a project has on the community. So, overall, conducting an effective economic or fiscal impact analysis requires careful planning, consistency, good timing, collaboration, and of course, clear communication. But following these best practices will lead to a much more reliable, actionable, and impactful study. And now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Dawn, who's going to run through some real-life examples of projects that have incorporated these best practices.
Great, thanks. So like Angela said, I'm just going to take a few minutes to go through some of the different ways impact analyses can be employed and show some of those best practices that Angela was just talking about. So our first example comes from Louisiana economic development, where tax incentives have been used to stimulate investment in the state's film, sound recording, and live production industries. And in 2018, LED partnered with us to evaluate the economic and fiscal impact of these tax programs, as well as to measure their return on investment for the state. The study was informed by spending and earnings data from the tax credit programs, tax rate information, and stakeholder interviews. And since that first 2018 study, the incentive programs have evolved and subsequent analyses were completed in 2020, 2022, and 2024 in an effort evaluating the impacts of these programs. And the reason this project is included as a best practice example is because while the incentive programs have changed over the years, we've been able to maintain the same baseline methodology for evaluating the programs, which makes comparing their impact across years super straightforward. We have also completed supplemental analysis as part of each study. So for example, in the 2021 and 2022 reports, we looked at the impact of NCIS New Orleans filming the state. And then more recently, we looked at top occupations related to the motion picture and film industries and Louisiana's education and workforce pipelines as they relate to those occupations. So in addition to industry-related analysis, we also do a lot of outdoor recreation-related impacts. And a few years ago, the old 7 Mile Bridge, which is a historic pedestrian walkway in the Florida Keys, needed an expensive refurbishment. And that was in addition to the bridge's ongoing costly maintenance needs. So Friends of Old 7, which is the nonprofit tasked with advocating for the bridge, hired Camoin Associates to conduct an economic and fiscal impact analysis on the proposed restoration and bridge enhancements. So data used in this analysis included annual visitation numbers and visitor spending data. And the project eventually secured approximately $44 million in funding from various sources, including the Florida Department of Transportation, Monroe County, and the City of Marathon. The rehabilitation efforts for the bridge started in 2017, and the bridge actually reopened to the public in January of 2022. And in this case, the best practice principle has to do with timing. So we really needed reliable annual visitation data to produce accurate results for this study. Friends of Old 7 actually had 3 years of visitation data that we were able to reference. But if that information wasn't readily available, the project timeline would have been adjusted in order to collect that reliable count information. Great. So next we're going to jump to the city of Northport, Florida. And here we actually began our impact analysis by conducting a real estate market study for 5 potential development areas. This real estate study informed our assumptions about potential development sizes and use types for each of the 5 sites. And building on those assumptions, we were then able to estimate the potential property value increases and tax revenues that could be collected by the city for those 5 different locations. And in addition to the quantitative analysis, the project team also engaged with the community and with stakeholders to gather insight and support. And as a result, the city unanimously adopted the development plan. And using data from the report, the city was able to secure a $1.69 million state grant to start developing some of that infrastructure. And this project really highlights how impact studies and assumptions often build on themselves, and the importance of taking the time to research and build out defensible assumptions before really diving into the impact portion of some studies. And just some kind of key tips for handling complex analysis, including creating flexible research plans, clearly identifying where you're getting your data or those numbers from, and communicating how certain assumptions build on those earlier findings in your reports. Cool. So moving over to Westchester County, Camoin Associates and the County IDA conducted an impact study on the Healthcare Talent Pipeline Program. And this program aims to support disadvantaged job seekers by providing healthcare training and helping them secure better employment. Data for this study was collected via a survey of the program's 104 graduates. And the survey gathered information on participants' annual incomes before and after training, the program training, which allowed us to identify income increases that were directly attributable to that program. Ultimately, the study found that for every dollar the county invested, the program generated $18.66 in total sales. Now, beyond those quantifiable economic benefits, the study also uncovered significant non-financial impacts through the survey and through interviews. The program enabled healthcare providers to fill essential positions and addressed local workforce shortages. And for participants or those receiving training in the program, it opened doors to healthcare careers that were previously inaccessible due to financial barriers or lack of other opportunity types. And this case study really shows how to use qualitative and quantitative analysis to provide a comprehensive view of an initiative or a program's true benefits. So making sure that you have that human element in your studies. Cool. And then finally, we're going to take a look at Lee Health, a large nonprofit in Florida. Lee Health collaborated with Camoin Associates to conduct an impact analysis and really highlight the value, their value to the broader community. So this study included data on on-site employment and on Lee Health's planned capital improvement projects. The analysis found that the nonprofit plays a significant role in the local community, and Lee Health effectively used the results as a public relation tool to really show those benefits and how they're more than just health services to that area. So successful communication was a key part of this process, ensuring that the findings of the analysis reached the right audience and that the project team stayed up to date along the way. So key tips for efficient communications in such studies include identifying that target audience early on, as well as holding bi-weekly meetings to keep the project aligned with the client's needs and objectives. And so in addition to clear communication with the project team, we also regularly create infographics for our clients because they provide a simple one-page way for our clients to communicate their benefits. And I believe Tori is actually going to talk a little bit more about infographics, but really how these impact studies can be utilized by the organizations or groups who commission them.
Thank you, Dawn, for providing so many great case studies. And we'll touch on a couple more as well. But as we've mentioned throughout our presentation, economic and fiscal impact studies help economic developers, policymakers, nonprofits, etc., make informed decisions, whether that's funding related, policy related, or purely communication on how projects are impacting the community to diverse audience. Economic impact studies provide data on how policies, projects, or events affect employment, income, business growth, and tax revenues, leading to more targeted and effective strategies in 3 key areas: optimizing resource allocation, business recruitment and retention, and advancing community development. And I'm going to provide more detail on each of those 3 key areas. So we talked a lot about storytelling today and communicating how projects impact communities. And as it relates to optimizing resources, we are measuring the return on investment and understanding if that was an efficient use of public funds and how we should prioritize projects moving forward based on the impacts of the project. So in measuring return on investment, we are assessing project success. And are we being transparent and holding people accountable for measuring outcomes or potential outcomes? You know, I know success looks different into every community, but by integrating study results into program and policy reviews, whether that's annually, every 2 to 5 years, policymakers can track the success of development initiatives, ensuring that they deliver the intended economic benefits. Additionally, Demonstrating the impact of projects helps justify future investments and maintains public trust by showing measurable outcomes and communicating what tax dollars are being spent on. Economic impact studies are a great way to connect policy in the community because these studies help demonstrate how investments in infrastructure, workforce development, and business incentives generate different types of returns. And lastly, before I touch on a real-world example, impact studies help prioritize projects, and findings highlight which industries or initiatives offer the highest economic returns, allowing us to be able to focus on high-impact areas that can boost local and regional growth. So I do want to pull in a real-world example here just to apply this. So an example that puts all of this into practice are New York industrial agencies, otherwise known as IDAs. IDAs are heavily regulated in New York. It is regulated by law that IDAs conduct a cost-benefit analysis on every project before offering financial assistance. Now, we work regularly with New York IDAs to conduct these analyses to showcase the cost versus the benefits for each project. And essentially, if spending public resources is going to support a project, what is the benefit of that? And is it a good use of funds based on the cost versus benefits? Now, I want to build on this example a little bit further as we're talking about IDAs. So one more example of how the state has taken economic impact studies a step further is, annual analysis of all IDAs across the state for the New York State Economic Development Council. So why is this important, right? So this analysis plays a crucial role in advocacy efforts, informing state-level policy decisions. So essentially, we provide best practices on how to ensure that public resources are used responsibly, helping policymakers feel confident in their continued support for these programs, especially when we're thinking financially, because they have data and hard numbers that directly relate to the financial assistance that was provided by IDAs for projects, and all of that is used through impact studies that have been conducted throughout the year. And something we talk a lot about in economic development is business attraction, retention, expansion projects. So this is going to be a really important way on how you can use an economic and fiscal impact study. So economic and fiscal impact studies support business attraction and retention efforts by showcasing value, providing data and opportunities for accessing capital, and customizing incentives for projects. So economic studies provide evidence of a region's economic potential and making it easier to attract new businesses and retain existing ones by showcasing tangible benefits of investment in the local economy. So this can be marketed to existing businesses and potential ones. And I want to provide an example of that. On the right-hand side, you can see an economic impact dashboard that we created for a client. It's interactive, which we love, and it updates. We update this information when a project is completed. So this dashboard showcases how much economic activity is happening in the community and can be used to market the growing economy and continued investment in the community, especially to site selectors and executives. I mentioned on our previous slide the importance of making funding decisions based on data, but on the private and nonprofit side, economic impact studies help open doors to accessing capital, like grants, revolving loan funds, lines of credit, because they have hard numbers to back up a project. And this is a way that we can support our businesses, nonprofits, and private organizations. And lastly, on the public sector side, communities can use economic impact studies to create customized incentive packages. Why is that helpful? It's because we can essentially use data to understand what information and projects we should prioritize and support to align with the needs of businesses and workforce trends. So essentially, we're using data to help us understand what kind of incentives need to be offered to support business sustainability, growth, and attraction. Now, all of these things tie together to advance community development. So overall, impact studies help advance community development through by showcasing how where development is occurring across a region and where projects are being concentrated. And essentially, economic impact studies help identify economic disparities and allow policymakers and economic developers to design more inclusive development strategies overall, really focusing in on equity and inclusion as we're thinking about developing our communities. In addition, understanding long-term economic impacts helps integrate sustainability and resiliency in development policies, ensuring that growth is responsible. Now, for example, on a local level, we've seen a lot of economic impact studies used in permitting processes. So as communities consider zoning changes or land use policy adjustments for new projects, they're using these studies to help inform those decisions. It helps them understand how land use decisions will impact their community. And lastly, we've talked a lot about stakeholder engagement. We've talked a lot about including people in the process. We can advance community development by building consensus and educating the public. Sharing economic impact results with the public and key stakeholders builds consensus and support for policies. We're really fostering collaboration between government, businesses, and the entire community. Impact studies serve as educational tools, informing citizens about how various projects benefit the local economy and encourages active participation in the policymaking process. Now I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to wrap us up with key takeaways and Q&A.
Thank you, Tori, for that. And yes, I will kind of wrap up with 4 key takeaways, and then we will open it up for any questions or comments. If you take nothing else away from today's webinar, I hope you remember these 4 items. First, impact analysis is a really important tool for economic development organizations to have in their toolkit. It's something you can pull out when you're trying to make a decision about what to pursue, what industry to focus on, what project to help move forward. It's a really important tool, and it can help you tell the story, inform your decision-making, and measure progress. So it's something that I hope you all are familiar with and are looking to use on a more regular basis. The second is about assumptions. So assumptions and the data inputs can make or break an impact analysis. The assumptions that we develop in the beginning will be the inputs that we use as part of the input-output model. So it really is that old line of garbage in, garbage out. So in order to get started with an impact analysis, you need to develop strong assumptions and data inputs that you feel really good about. Making and gathering these assumptions that you feel strong about is critical to having a final product that you can defend. As was mentioned earlier, we take this very seriously, and we often will work just internally trying to poke holes in each other's assumptions, so that when we then need to defend it to the public or to clients or in an adversarial situation, we can feel really good about standing behind the data that we use to make our analysis. And so you need to be aware that the assumptions that you use and the model you use will not always have the outcome that you are happy with. The analysis is the analysis. And so really standing firm in those assumptions that you make in the beginning can help you feel confident that although maybe the results aren't what you expected, you can feel really good about the data that was used to get there. And so if you're working on any kind of analysis like this, if you're working with a consultant partner or with a partner organization, taking time in the beginning to get those assumptions right is something you should really focus on and make sure everyone is taking that seriously. Because you don't want to get to the end of your analysis, the outcomes aren't really what you were expecting, and then you go back and you fiddle with the assumptions and think that you're going to then be able to get an outcome that you like. So that's not how it should work. You feel really good about your assumptions in the beginning, and then you take what the answers are in the end. So that's really important. The third is to really make sure you're thinking about why you're doing the report. Why are you doing it right now? So what is most important to the target audience? Is it the numbers? Is it the stories? Is it trends over time? Is it the impact on the local or the state economy? Really going in with that understanding of what you're trying to accomplish will be important so that you're not wasting your time. Make sure everyone you're working with is on board with the purpose for why you're doing it and what you're hoping to get in terms of a final deliverable so that you're getting an easily digestible report that speaks to the audience you're looking to talk to and allows people to review it, understand it, and feel able like they can digest the information that's coming at them. As I mentioned, impact analyses can be really complicated methodologies with a lot of technical terms. So the final product for your audience should be really clear, able to digest it, able to get from what are our inputs to what are our outputs, and feel like they are able to keep up. And so that's really important from the start. And finally, using a consistent methodology can certainly allow for ease of comparison from year to year. But remember, the model won't account for all the changes in the economy. So it didn't know that COVID was going to hit us and supply chains were going to go all wonky. It can't account for all of those things that come up. So there is certainly some art to the work that we do, and we need to be able to stay flexible and remember that it is a tool, but it certainly is not a crystal ball. And so that it is, again, a tool in your toolbox that can help you make decisions, but it can't be everything for you. So finally, if you'd like to download either of our white papers, we have one on economic impact and one on fiscal impact. You can certainly do that using the QR code, but happy to take any questions. Clay, if you have any in the chat, or if anyone wants to come off mute, happy to take questions.
Yeah, so like Rachel just said, if anybody has anything, you can either drop it in the chat or just come off of mute, and we'll give everybody a few seconds to do so. Anybody?
I'd be curious if anyone is doing an impact analysis right now or considering it for a particular project. If you want to brainstorm, happy to better understand your experience with economic impact studies.
All right, I guess you all just did that good of a job of covering everything, right?
I guess so.
Well, I do want to thank you all and the Camoin team. That was very well orchestrated, how you all bounced around like that. That was very smooth. So thank you all for that. And thanks to everybody from your team. And I know your all's contact information's up there. I want to thank everyone for joining today. And if you all have any last comments or anything that you want to say on this page, feel free.
Oh, is there a chat? Oh, wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, SEDC, for organizing. Reach out with any questions. We're happy to talk about any of this. But enjoy doing some economic impact studies.
Yeah. All right. Thank you all so much. I hope everyone has a great day.
Yeah, take care.